this information?
Yes, it's something we don't do now, but I believe the technical capabilities are there. They need to be assembled. They need to be operationalized. Environment Canada produces monthly and seasonal forecasts. Those forecasts could be used to force models, the same models we use for flood prediction or drought prediction on this seasonal basis. And that, I think, would have tremendous benefit, as you mentioned, because it would be information in time to be actionable by the farmers to make the shifts so they can stay in business.
And so the monitoring, not necessarily on the reservoirs, but actually on soil moisture content. And the farmer from Quebec said, I need drain tiles. He's got floods. So he has to make different decisions on getting drain tiles on his fields.
Yes, the monitoring, you can measure soil moisture from space with some accuracy, at least shallow soil moisture. But to get deep soil moisture, you need sensors in the ground. And that's where we have this Global Water Futures Observatories network, which has these sorts of things. They tend not to be done provincially, and the federal government just has them at Ag Canada stations. So.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. On to Madame Posey for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. The floods, the droughts, of course, both are related to how much water there is and can take place at different times, last different time periods, and they take place in a number of different places, of course, all very diverse. And you feel there's an advantage to drawing this all together. Is there really an advantage to managing threats of flood and drought within a same strategy? And do you know if this is being done elsewhere in another G7 country, for example? Is there an optimal model?
Yes, it's part of what's called Earth system modeling, Earth system prediction, and this is where Europe has been headed with their approaches, as well as the United States. So the most sophisticated countries are going to these complete Earth system models, which have the general predictions that are possible for both floods and droughts, and potentially water quality episodes as we develop them in the future.
Une autre question.
And another question. An article was published in Nature about AI. It seems that it's possible to be highly accurate even if in rivers there aren't any sensors, any gauges for water levels. So, using artificial intelligence, do you think there are any risks to security? Are we far enough ahead, really, in our understanding of all this to use artificial intelligence for these purposes?
Artificial intelligence certainly has a role. It's essentially data-driven techniques, and where these models have been tested in Canada, they haven't done very well because we don't have very much data. We have parts of Canada which have a stream gauging network that's as sparse as the developing world. This is when you get into northern Canada or the really remote rural areas. So we don't have the data to train it. And further, we have, with changing climate and new types of floods and things like that, the historical data that would train the AI systems is not what we're going to see in the future. But they have a role, and perhaps in combination with some of the physics-based models that are out there, that they can provide some benefit. And certainly on the human side of it, they can provide tremendous benefit.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the end of the 2.5 minutes. And Ms. Collins for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Palmer, you mentioned insurance costs, and in the next panel we're going to be talking to some folks who have been looking at areas that can't get insured because of climate impacts. And I'm curious, this could be to Mr. Scarpielleggia or to Dr. Palmer, do you have any concerns that this kind of forecasting could impact Canadians who are in these areas and their insurability, and kind of what responsibility does government have to ensure that insurance companies are still, and insurance is still available to Canadians?
That's a really interesting question. I would think that, I know that when flood maps are redesigned, and there are flood maps, the flood maps are being redesigned in Quebec at the moment, and it's creating a lot of controversy because all of a sudden if you find that your house is in what is now considered a flood zone, you lose a great deal of value on your property. I would think that accurate forecasts, as long as they're accurate, then you're not getting a false picture or a picture that could be called into question. That you are getting an accurate picture of risks, and I suppose it could influence insurance costs. But I think the flood itself would have an impact on one's insurance, and that's why the government is bringing in. And I'm not speaking for the government. As I said before, I'm not representing the government, but the government did commit to a low-cost national flood insurance program for those who can no longer get insurance. And some of my areas in my riding have been touched by floods twice now in 2017 and 2019, and people just can't get insurance anymore there.
Two things. One is that the insurance companies are already running their models in secret. There's a number of them across Canada. They're all different, and I don't think any of them are very good. So some people are being charged for floods that they shouldn't have. The second is that if we can predict floods, we can reduce damages, and that should reduce costs all around the board. So so imagine what our damages for crops would be if we, or other events if we had no weather forecasts at all. So the same thing for flood forecasts. We can reduce damages this way, and we should be able to reduce insurance costs.
Very good. That's it for 2.5 minutes. So on to Mr. Deltel for 5.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. And kind MP, it's nice to see you working on this. Dr. Pomeroy as well.
Vous avez utilisé, docteur, une image qui m'est restée.
So you brought up an image that really struck me, saying that every province and territory has built its own wheel, if you wish. So we've got 13 wheels we're trying to work with, and that the aim of this bill put forward by our colleague from Lac-Saint-Louis is to bring these all together in a single vehicle. Do you think we can do this quickly, or will it take years before all 13 wheels are rolling in the same direction?
The wheels are all different right now, and some are pretty sophisticated and some are very, very simple. So there'll be tremendous benefit early on for the jurisdictions which have no system or simple systems provided by this. The more advanced jurisdictions will also see it. In our discussions with them for the province of Quebec, they saw benefit to using both the federal and the provincial model that they had to give them some idea of the uncertainty in the predictions in there. So I think we can see immediate benefits all around, and because these systems all exist, I would think a rapid evolution towards improvement will happen, and then eventually perhaps the concerted generation of the next phase, the next generation of prediction models can occur on a national basis. That will take longer, but it's certainly possible.
You also raised the example of the United States of America that has, and you said that earlier, that in some point they have that kind of system that the member of Lac-Saint-Louis would like to apply. Can you give us some indication how can we get inspiration from the experience in America that can be useful for us?
A number of things there. One is that they do not do it all from Washington. They have regional centers. Even though they're federally led, they're based on river basins. So Northeast U.S., North Central U.S., Alaska, Northwest, and on river basins. They also coordinate heavily with the states involved and with the other communities to do so. And then finally, but they have the central resources for the supercomputer systems and the army of scientists that they have in different agencies, such as U.S. Geological Survey and their Weather Service and the Army Corps of Engineers. They have to coordinate all of this as well. But they've done it reasonably well over time, but still feel they need to make much further and much more rapid progress. That's why they set up this new cooperative institute to accelerate the improvements in that.
When did they create that facility, or I would say that institute to work all together in the same front?
This goes back at least to the 1960s, and that's perhaps before. So, but it was you don't see the states doing this really at all down there, except helping with expertise into the federal system. So it's a bit of a different constitutional setup as well.
Supposons que le projet de loi est voté et
So let's say that we vote on this bill, it's adopted, and the Senate adopted as well within the next month. Based on your knowledge, what you know of the Canadian and the American systems, how long, more or less, would it take before Canada really winds up with one single wheel, everyone rolling in the same direction, all 13 instances, and that this, is working efficiently?
I see it still as 13 wheels, but one engine supplying extra power to those wheels as they need, because we have very different provincial realities on the ground. I think we can find immediate gains by data flow, by coordination, even by provinces sharing bilaterally information together. Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba all predict the Saskatchewan River system. And so that's certainly an easy win right there to make that better. The final thing then would be development of systems that are suitable for Canada, where we have frozen ground, we have snowmelt, we have ice melt, and river ice jams that other countries don't. And we'll have to find those solutions ourselves, and we'll have to make sure that they're in our system and we're not relying on what other countries have developed that way.
last question. Do you think we can do that with no new money?
We can take advantage of programs such as the $78 million Global Water Futures Program, which is ending now. It's in the rollout period. When we built Global Water Futures, we knew we'd be building these models. I wanted a home for them. I never thought the home would be the United States. So I wanted to be here. And so you have that investment that could be leveraged here with really just a few personnel and some more meetings and gaining efficiencies. So I don't think it's expensive, not in the things that I've seen in the federal government. So,
Thank you very much. And for our last questioner, Ms. Chatel, for 5 minutes.
Ma question, oui.
This bill is very interesting, given that we should keep in mind that Canada is the only country.
Other mics, and then turn that one off. Please.
Voilà.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. So let me start from the top, if I may. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us here today. My question. I think that this bill is very important given the current context, Canada being the only country, only G7 country, that still doesn't have any legislation, any national strategy to prevent droughts and floods. What have the effects of having no coordinated strategy involving all provinces and territories been? I could try to provide you with an answer. This is the example that I wanted to give you at the very end of my opening statement, and Dr. Pomeroy did bring it up. In Calgary in 2013, it was 2013 in Calgary, yes. Anyway, we saw that the model, quite a nuanced and well-developed model, quite sophisticated then, that had been worked up in Europe, and we used it in a pilot project, analyzing the situation out in Western Canada. And the model had predicted a very severe flood 8 days before the actual event took place. But that hadn't been possible. At least the province of Alberta was not at the time able to provide a prediction that far ahead. So I think the advantages are pretty clear. A little earlier, Chair, we were mentioning the costs for elaborating, developing a new strategy. Mr. Pomeroy, however, you are bringing up the fact that taking no action, given climate change, is even greater. The forecasting models must be very accurate, though, and very flexible. When they are, communities would be able to avoid the worst effects of these disasters on their local economies. Is that correct?
accurate flood predictions can reduce the damages. Obviously, they can't stop the rain, they can't stop the snowmelt, but they allow time for reservoirs to be operated differently, for sandbagging and other measures to be put into place, for individuals to take action, including getting out of town. There are many things that don't happen with the lack of warning, and so the expenses are dramatically reduced when adequate flood warning is provided. And this has been shown around the world repeatedly. When we look at the deaths and damages in the developing world from floods, the one in Libya last year comes to mind. There was no warning system operating at the time. There was tremendous, horrific casualties and damages in that case. We already have small damages in Canada in terms of loss of life and things like this because of exceptional emergency services and all of that. But we can't be completely reliant upon those to reduce these. We have to have that previous warning. We're starting already to see the benefits of the federal system in that it helped work with the province of Quebec on floods 3 years ago and provided an accurate early warning to that region. So that was a test of that system. But again, that's not a formalized relationship across the country, but it was a demonstration that we can do at least as well as the European systems when it comes down to these predictions.
Fermiers ont beaucoup de difficultés là, avec son taux au front. Hein.
Agricultural producers are facing more and more difficulties. They're really on the front line with climate change. How could this strategy help them better plan their seasons?
Our farmers and water managers are seeing events that they haven't seen in their lifetimes and outside of their experience with a lead time of 3 and particularly 6 months. That's enough time to order different seed. That's enough time to make decisions on forage and others. It's also time for the irrigation districts to make their plans and make the announcements about the water that will be available to irrigation farmers so that, again, they can make their plans. So I think there's tremendous benefit there and economic benefit if we can do this. Right now we have a wonderful drought monitoring system through Agriculture Canada, but it's not really a drought prediction system. And the same software, the same computer models can be used for floods and droughts and many other things, and including agricultural productivity, including water supply for hydroelectricity. There's many, many applications of the system, but it has to be in place and it has to be running. So,
Thank you, and that concludes our line of questioning. Mr. Scarpaleggi, congratulations. You made it through the hour of questioning unscathed, relatively. And thank you, Dr. Pomeroy, for your words and insisting, Francis, there. You certainly bring the whole discussion of water up to a whole new level of understanding, too. So I thank you for that and for what you do in back home and all your research, because it does. I've dealt with you before in accessing your research, and there is some really good points there that we need to discuss further, that's for sure. So with that, I'll conclude. We'll just suspend for a couple minutes, and we'll get ready for the next hour. Well, do I have to gavel? Oh.
Oui, alors on va. Merci à Madame Posé et Monsieur May.
Thank you, Ms. Posey and Mr. Maziere, for having held the chair, and I do congratulate you for your mastery of your roles and managing the discussion so well. We're now into our second panel. We have 4 groups speaking to us this afternoon. We'll begin with Ms. Wanda McFadden, the Executive Director of the Assiniboine River Basin Initiative. You have 5 minutes, Madam.
Committee members, it is an honor to speak to you today on behalf of the Bill C-317. As we all know, water respects no boundaries, be it in times of floods or drought. So it's critically important that different water authorities across the country come together to be able to share standardized data and be able to share that with stakeholders that work on the landscape that rely on that data in a timely manner. I want to speak to 2 flood events that happened within our basin in recent years. The flood of 2011, which was a 1 in 300 year event, and 2014, which was a 1 in 500 event. These 2 floods were catastrophic in nature. In one instance, one community saw 11,000 residents evacuated from their homes, 4,000 homes and businesses impacted. The mental health impacts to communities in times of floods is astronomical and goes on for years and years. The flood of 2014 saw communities marooned without supplies for days on end, as well as rural residents. So floods also impact infrastructure, they impact farmland, they impact businesses, etc. So we need to look at that and work together collaboratively on those across the country. And as we've heard from Dr. Pomeroy, insurance is also impacted, which is a huge piece of the puzzle to those on the landscape. The flip side, of course, is drought, and we are starting to experience that in unprecedented levels. The difference between a drought and a flood is that droughts can go on for many months, many years, and floods tend to have a smaller, shorter impact, but wreak havoc on infrastructure for years to come and the replacement to that. So I think it's very important that we look at that. Both of these impact mental health, economic well-being of the communities. They impact the environment, the landscape, and all creatures that habitat those landscapes. And when I say communities, I'm referring to not to all communities, First Nations, rural residents, urban residents, etc. And they cross international boundaries. As we've heard earlier, we have to be respectful of the fact that water does flow across rural boundaries. So I would strongly, on behalf of our organization, encourage the committee to work towards the development of a true national strategy that would enable all jurisdictions to share data in a standardized and understandable format to prepare for and react to floods and droughts. In working across those those jurisdictional boundaries, they must recognize that those boundaries are municipal, provincial, as well as international. Communication, cooperation, and coordination are all common goals that will lead to success of this program if it's to roll out. You must invest in working with us, the grassroots stakeholders, groups like ourselves, the Indigenous communities on the landscape, agriculture, conservation. All of those groups hold a wealth of knowledge and have developed a network and a trust on the landscape with those impacted. And in many, many instances, they are the first responders on the landscape, working with local residents, be it in times of flood or in times of drought. Working towards creating resiliency where all stakeholders have the ability and tools before them to adapt to change in order to achieve not only environmental sustainability, but remain viably on an economical side of things for themselves and for the well-being of their communities. The goals of this also must realize that research and adaptation of best management practices and the utilization of tools that may assist in the process that is developed are key to its success. Transparent processes are a must. You must include transparent communication and information exchange in order to lead to success of the programs. And we must never, never forget the golden rule of water. Do unto others, do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you. So I'm very pleased to be able to present you with this information today, and I'm quite willing to answer any questions. We're very pleased to see this strategy move forward and would encourage you around the table to not forget about us, the grassroots individuals that can help this become a success across Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McFadden. We'll go now to the Citizens Climate Lobby. We have, I believe, is it Ms. Lindman who will be speaking, or will you be sharing your time with Ms. Orlando? Who will be starting?
Kathy Orlando will be starting, and
Okay.
we'll be sharing our time.
Perfect. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Orlando.
5-minute presentation.
Thank you for the privilege of speaking with you today. My name is Kathy Orlando, and I work as the Director of Programs at Citizens Climate International and the Director of Citizens Climate Lobby Canada. I live in Sudbury, Ontario, and I've been concerned about the climate crisis my whole adult life. My father-in-law was Dr. Sukhdev P. Mathur. He was an IPCC scientist for the first report in 1990. I support volunteers in over 100 ridings in Canada and over 50 countries around the world in their noble efforts to bring evidence-based climate solutions to their governments and fellow citizens. Katerina is one of them. Please go ahead, Katerina.
Hi, I'm Katerina Lindman, and
Excuse
I'm a
me,
retired
sorry,
actuary.
Ms. Lindman, I hate to interrupt. With this hybrid format, we have to ensure that the sound quality is appropriate for the interpreters so as not to damage their hearing. And unfortunately, I'm told that maybe for reason of connection, they won't be able to interpret your remarks. Unfortunately, I'm sure you've submitted them in writing, but that won't take away from the time that the entire that the Citizens Climate Lobby has. Ms. Orlando, would you like to continue? I'm sorry about that, Ms. Lindman. It's just a health and safety issue. We tried to resolve the matter, but we couldn't technically do that. So, Ms. Orlando, would you like to continue?
Yes, I will. Katerina is a retired actuary, and she has been concerned about climate change for about 30 years. As an actuary, she joined actuarial committees studying climate change and sustainability, and she chaired the committee that created the Actuaries Climate Index in about 2013. The Actuaries Climate Index measures the frequency of climate extremes and shows that these extremes are increasing at an unprecedented rate. And so she did whatever she could to lower her household emissions and wanted to help Canada enact effective climate policies. Thus, she joined Citizens Climate Lobby in 2013. Citizens Climate Lobby is a nonpartisan advocacy organization dedicated to promoting effective climate policies. And we began in 2010 in Canada. We have two stories here about precipitation and drought. In the winter of 2018-2019, I, in Sudbury, Ontario, experienced record precipitation. Ice built up on the roof of my house. Professionals could not remove it. On the first warm day in spring in late March, the ice on the front of the house melted faster than the back of the house. The roof collapsed internally. Walls pulled away from each other. My house was condemned, and we were forced to evacuate. We lived in a hotel for over 6 months. The entire upper floor had to be reinforced and the roof replaced. We had special insurance, and all our costs were covered. 3 other houses on our street experienced similar internal structure failures, but not nearly as catastrophic, and they are facing huge bills to fix their roof and house. I live on a street with just 16 houses. Last summer, Katerina, whose son lives in Yellowknife, Northwest Territory, had to evacuate for 3 weeks due to forest fires, which were generally unheard of that far north. And since he only rode out of Yellowknife, he had to drive towards the fire to get south away from the fire. and a large contributing factor to the forest fires was climate-related drought. So droughts not only impact farmers and crops, they contribute to forest fires as well. Right now, Canada is experiencing widespread drought ahead of a wildfire season after experiencing a devastating one last year. Here are some numbers. Canada in 2023, the uninsured losses were $3.1 billion. Both economic insured losses with fingerprints of climate change were all over them, have increased dramatically over 20 years. Worldwide, economic losses of $380 billion USA is three times more than the amount insured losses of $118 billion US. So in Canada, the economic losses were much more than $3 billion, perhaps around $9 billion if we were to extrapolate. We have submitted a much longer version of this presentation, and it is below.
Thank you.
But lastly, we appreciate this. Canada is developing a national strategy for drought and flood forecasting.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we have your written submission as well, so the analysts will be able to pore over that. We'll go now to Mr. Sanford, who's been with us before during this study, and of course he is the Senior Government Relations Liaison, Global Climate Emergency Response for the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment and Health. Go ahead, Mr. Sanford, you have 5 minutes.
Please allow me to begin by extending the very best wishes of the United Nations to all. I would like, in the time that I have, to put the question of whether Canada needs a national flood and drought prediction strategy into a global context. On the global scale, because we waited so long to act on the threat, climate heating has gone away on us, and now what scientists and governments must do is chase after it with the hope of catching up and getting ahead of it. Our current global situation takes us beyond the first stage of climate change impacts, that of more frequent and intense extreme weather events and changes in global precipitation patterns, to the second stage of climate impacts on national security, increases in intra and interstate conflict, and the specter of an explosion in involuntary human migration that is already resulting in a rapid rise in climate refugees for which the world is unprepared. Welcome to the future. If humanity fails to rein in emissions quickly and tightly enough, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projects that 1/2 to 3/4 of the human population could routinely be exposed to life-threatening heat and humidity. Food production systems will be severely undermined. Increased heat, stress, drought, soil degradation, destruction of crops by disease and insects, and extreme events could render about 1/3 of currently suitable cropland unsuitable for farming by 2100. Multiple breadbasket crop failures spanning several world regions at once would become routine. The number of people at the high risk of hunger, malnutrition, and diet-related mortality would grow by as much as 80 million. That would be famine writ large. By later this century, it's projected that as many as 3.5 billion people could be compelled to migrate out of their region, nation, or continent by flooding, storms, fires, extreme heat, and humidity. You will remember that Europe nearly came apart when it was overwhelmed by refugees from the Syrian civil war. We are already having trouble in Canada aligning immigration policy with our own domestic housing and expanding infrastructure deficits. And now we see we have our own climate refugees. By some estimates, as many as 200,000 Canadians were evacuated or displaced by wildfires or floods in 2023 alone, some permanently. And we're already beginning to see what is scientists have already predicted some time ago. If we did not act immediately on the climate threat, we might find ourselves in a situation where we cannot keep up with the frequency of climate-related disasters. As the number of these events multiply, we will not be able to recover from one before the arrival of the next. And look at the heat wave, wildfires, then floods of 2021 and again in 2023 in British Columbia, and the heat wave, permafrost thaw, hydrologic drought, and recurring wildfire evacuations in the Northwest Territories in 2023. These kinds of compound events are already occurring in some places here with little or no relief in between. And as we've seen elsewhere, recurring climate disasters of this frequency can bankrupt whole nations, and they're going to keep happening. And as already noted, what is being missed is the mental health impacts of recurring disasters. Psychologists predict that if we don't get ahead of the climate threat, mental health effects of global climate breakdown will outweigh the direct physical effects on us by a factor of perhaps 40 to 1. And again, for this, we are unprepared. In closing, I repeat that we are in the midst of a national climate emergency. Canada, in my view, needs a national flood, drought, and wildfire prediction strategy. Without a strategy of this kind, a great many people could needlessly die, be displaced, and be unnecessarily traumatized, and parts of the country impoverished. One would think that governments that ignore this pending reality would do so at their own peril.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Sanford. Et on termine.
Thank you, Mr. Sanford. And we will wind up the testimony with the Outaouais River Keepers. We have from that group Laura Rinesborough, Riverkeeper and Chief Executive Officer. She is accompanied by Lisa Ryan, who will speak first, I understand.
For having us here today. Mr. Sanford painted a global picture, and I'll bring you very local now to the Ottawa River watershed. Here we are, and whenever your service brings you to the National Capital Region, you are directly depending on the Ottawa River and its tributaries for your survival. Our drinking water today as well, so cheers. I'll be presenting along with my colleague Larissa Holman, Director of Science and Policy. You recently met her. She presented at the Freshwater Study as well. We were just invited a few days ago to present, and the timing is impeccable. We have prepared a flow changes report in the Ottawa River watershed using data that has existed for years from federal data, but had never before been analyzed from a watershed lens. So to truly look at the data for what is happening in the Ottawa River watershed, and the results are eye-opening. So this Ottawa River watershed, it is vast. It has a surface area more than twice that of the province of New Brunswick. It provides drinking water for you and 2 million people. And the flow of the Ottawa River can be so great that it can exceed that of all of the Great Lakes combined. It has been given the moniker of the 6th Great Lake as a result. So we have a mighty, mighty river flowing through our nation's capital. I'll speak about our experiences with the floods of 2017 and 2019 that have informed our comments today. But it is also important to note that this mighty river is also affected by drought. So we need to take into consideration even our mightiest of rivers are impacted by both floods and droughts. In just 2 weeks from now, we'll be releasing our first watershed report card, and we've analyzed 14 different indicators. Changes in flow is one of them, as I mentioned. Despite the availability of flow data through the Water Survey of Canada, our watershed report card is the first report that has conducted analysis on the data trends for both flooding and periods of low flow at a watershed scale. The jurisdictions within this watershed are very complex. The river itself becomes a border between Ontario and Quebec. And when the Ottawa River experienced extensive flooding in both 2017 and 2019, many of you will remember that, it caused extensive damage to infrastructure, property, and to people's homes. Both the Ontario and Quebec governments attempted to address the flooding in different ways, thereby working separately to confront an issue that cannot be solved one side of the river at a time. We see a need in this context, like many other watersheds, where political jurisdictions need to be coordinated in order to ensure that the response is effective. This applies to predictions and forecasting as well. So we've looked specifically at Bill C-317 and have a few recommendations to put forward.
Specifically in Section 3, we'd like to make the following recommendations. In Section 3A, Ottawa Riverkeeper recommends that when considering the application of novel technologies in forecasting floods and droughts, it is critical to consider the impact on aquatic ecosystems and how to ensure riverine environments are not adversely affected. An example of this is during the summer, there are recreational levels held back behind some dams and in head ponds. And below those dams, we see examples of low water events that persist for extended periods of time. This has a very strong impact on ecological health and an impact on ecosystems as a whole.
I'll look at Section 3B, where we recommend that you consider how expertise developed in regions can be shared to ensure that all watersheds are able to build the capacity to undertake activities at a local or regional level. This echoes some of what Ms. McFadden was speaking about, that there is local knowledge, local context that can add value and confirm results from predictions made at a larger scale. Here in Ontario, conservation authorities in the southern part of the Ottawa River watershed have developed excellent flood mapping capabilities as well as flood and drought forecasting.
I'm sorry to have to cut you off, but we're at 5 minutes, but we do have it in writing. So, yeah, but we'll go to we'll try and do one round of questions. We're running a bit late. We'll start with Mr. Deltel for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Aux gens qui sont sur la ligne.
Thank you very much, Chair. And those of you who've been helping us, thank you so much for your testimony. Thank you, ladies, and welcome to our committee. Ladies, I would like to first ask you about 2017 and 2019. Most of us here were elected officials then, so we do remember what took place. Then I had to cross the river on a daily basis, my apartment being on the other side, and we were all, of course, affected by that experience. So what have you learned about the relationship between the two provinces from that disaster? As you know, the river links us. What could we learn from that? And what could throw light on the bill we're now looking at? Thank you, MP Deltel.
Continue my point on this.
Go on. Yeah.
And so what we see is that in Ontario, conservation authorities have excellent flood mapping, but they are not comprehensive for covering all of the province of Ontario. And so similar work can be done, recreated in the areas where there are not conservation authorities. And then on the Quebec side of the Ottawa River watershed, that there have been errors made in the forecasting, and that has had impacts on a number of property owners in particular. And so the data that is made available, the analysis done for flood mapping, needs to be confirmed with local knowledge and local context in order to ensure that there is accuracy involved, because there are considerable implications when errors are made.
If I could just jump in as well, sure, another piece there is after the 2019 floods, the Ontario government did a report on the flooding in both the Ottawa River and the St. Lawrence River, and found that that there was a number of different reasons that there was such enormous floods in that time. It had a lot to do with the snowpack and the rain events, but that one of the things that could be greatly improved upon was communications between the two rivers, and that was something that has been highlighted for the Ottawa River Regulation Planning Board, and they've been moving forward and improving their communications, but there is always room for improvement in how does this data get down to municipalities and people at the local level.
When you talk about communications, is that communication between two provinces or two municipalities or jurisdiction to the people?
I mean, both. Both of them can be improved greatly.
Okay, so with I would say the experience of 2017 and 2019, have we seen a progress or nothing have changed since that?
There has been a lot of improvements from the Ottawa River Regulation Planning Board in terms of the communications that they are putting forward. There is still, and there was another heavy flow event in 2023, and there was much improved communication at that time. I think there's also been an awareness that has been risen for the municipalities themselves on their responsibilities to let residents know what is happening, because many people were caught off guard in 2017, and then the duration of the 2019 floods was just so extensive that there clearly needed to be more support provided at the local level.
So we're talking a lot about local level, talking about provinces. Mm-hmm. So what the federal can do on that?
Pardon?
What the federal government can do?
Yeah, I see that the need to bring together the strategy at a national, federal level, that provides a lot of opportunity for the data to be confirmed. So the data that provinces have, that can be confirmed, that can be also confirmed, not rolled out at a grand level and provided in a top-down manner, but being able to be done in concert with the information and data available from more local contexts, that there's a lot of opportunity that can come by bringing those together.
The federal government also has the capacity to support some of these initiatives. And as we heard from the previous witnesses, there's a lot of great examples in different parts of the country, and having that communication from a national perspective will only help to improve models at a local level.
My final question: do you think that we could learn a lot from your experience that we had here, 2017 and 19, that can apply from coast to coast, whatever the river is?
I mean, I think that we saw, similar to what Ms. McFadden was saying, is that we saw people coming to organizations like Ottawa Riverkeeper to find out what was happening. We hold trust with community, and so I think that there's a role where organizations at the watershed level, at the local level, can help to ensure that there is confidence among the public around what is happening in that panic moment of an extreme event.
Madame Taylor-Roy.
Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Oh, just one moment. Sorry, I have to plug my headphones in. Okay. Checked earlier, so they should be fine. Yes, I just wanted to follow up on that. You said a number of interesting things in your comments regarding the sharing of local knowledge, and it's been mentioned a few times. Expertise developed in regions can be shared. And I'm wondering, I know the government, the Public Safety Canada was developing a national risk profile for Canada. And in doing so, they were integrating scientific evidence and input from stakeholders nationwide to improve understanding of disaster risks in all sectors of society. I was wondering if you know anything about this and whether you think this could be used as a model for how that local information is brought into the planning, the flood forecasting. And then also if you could comment on how you see the dissemination of that information, the communication between different municipalities or areas across Canada. And I was directing that to the Ottawa River Keepers.
So I don't believe we're familiar with the risk assessment that you spoke of. It's not something that we've responded to directly, but it sounds like it would be an important step to be taking when trying to understand how to properly put in place flood forecasting. One of the things that we have looked at is changes in flow and how flow is shifting in river systems, specifically the Ottawa River watershed. And what we are seeing is that flooding events, and this is not a huge surprise, especially this year where it is so warm and dry so early, is that we're seeing flooding events are happening earlier. And that's not just this year. We looked at it in 30-year data sets to try and capture that from a climate perspective. And so not only is spring flooding happening earlier, but summer periods of low flow are being extended for longer periods of time. So we're definitely seeing impacts of changes in river flow, and that would definitely inform when people would need to be prepared for flooding events. These are beginning to happen earlier, and a stronger understanding of what can be done to prepare earlier in the seasons.
Thank you very much. And my next question is for Mr. Sanford from the UN University. And you mentioned that you feel like we're chasing after climate change with a hope of catching up right now. And we've heard several questions during the questioning around this bill regarding the cost of putting in place a national flood and drought forecasting system. Often it seems that people are focused on the cost of something without looking at the cost of not putting it in place. And I was wondering if you could address, you talked about some specific things, the impacts on national security, human migration, conflict zones. Could you just address broadly what the cost of not dealing with these climate events that are happening and taking action to stop the increase in greenhouse gases and climate change, the heating of the planet, what those costs look like generally to our planet?
Well, I think that when you look at that, first of all, I thank you for that very, very important question and observation, because we're only beginning to see just what those costs might look like. And we have to first determine exactly what kind of impacts we're talking about. When climate change migrations become a crisis of national security, the costs can be quite dramatic in terms of the loss of GDP, productivity, stability, public health costs, security costs, etc. And when you get large portions of the world's population undergoing exactly the same types of pressures, the costs can be absolutely beyond imagination. And I think Dr. Pomeroy put it quite well in his statements when he said that we have many of the elements in place. We're one of the countries that's very fortunate to have university programs that have been publicly funded over a long period of time that can allow us to get ahead of those costs. Because clearly for a very long time we've been saying the cost of no action is much greater than the cost in acting on it. And this is one way of acting on it that costs can be minimal compared to what the absolutely shattering economic and social impacts and mental health impacts could be if we don't. I'm sorry, I'm not
You're on mute.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, part of the difficulty is in actually estimating the cost of an action, whereas the cost of a program like putting in place a flood and drought forecasting system can be fairly well known, especially through the Canada Water Agency. When we look to these costs of an action, people are often at a loss to try and come up with numbers. How do you suggest that we deal with that issue? Because often we see that people just don't address it or don't try and estimate it, and we're left just with the cost of action.
Can you answer that in about 15 seconds, Mr. Sanford?
Okay.
Sorry.
I think that's been well brought up, because what happens is we know what the costs are of damage. And we know if you calculate exactly what the cost of producing a strategy like this would be in action, we can calculate, and I'm sure the answer would be a fraction of those costs.
Thank you. Madame Posé, à vous la parole.
Oui. Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to our witnesses. 1 second. Mr. Sanford, yes, indeed, Mr. Sanford. In your opening remarks, you really gave us a global overview of the effects of climate change on life itself, on human life. You mentioned agriculture, health, refugees, climate refugees, more particularly. You covered a number of issues. There's something that I read recently. This is something I saw coming out in March. There are agricultural producers in Western Canada. For years now, there's been drought conditions, in particular in Alberta. So even the oil and gas companies out there are preparing for future water shortages. So I thought that was very interesting. We know that in Canada, the largest producers of greenhouse gases are the companies using the oil sands out west. And now these companies that still intend to increase their production are actually facing water shortages. So I thought that, well, it's a high-risk situation, isn't it? There being so little improvement on their side, these oil and gas companies, given the current status of, the climate change peril. So we know that these are phenomena that are getting worse and worse, the floods and the droughts, and I think that we need to mobilize science and base our public decisions on science. Can you tell us what's going on around the world on this level? And why is it that Canada is lagging behind? Because it seems to me that that's what you said at the outset. And what can we do to correct this?
It's important to recognize that agriculture is your baseline economic sector here that we're talking about. And if agriculture has serious difficulties in productivity and great costs, damage, et cetera, it's going to work its way up the entire economic ladder throughout the whole country. And I think it's fair to say that we're not necessarily lagging behind other countries. Other countries are trying to manage this and grasp what we are seeing as projections for future, especially with respect to population dynamics disruptions. But I don't think any country yet has fully come to terms with how rapidly this is happening and how extensive these changes could be if we're not very effective in moving as quickly as we can in the ways that we can to protect our populations and to predict as much as we can in advance, as much as we can, what these kinds of impacts might mean on a seasonal and annual basis.
En effet, on parlait beaucoup de...
Indeed. Mitigation is a big topic that's often addressed, and also really reducing our greenhouse gas output. I think that over the years we haven't moved quickly enough or in a concerted fashion. So now we have to talk about mitigation more than reducing greenhouse gases. Anyway, they're both important. Thank you so much for your presentation and so forth. I will now turn to these ladies from the Outaouais region. As everyone knows, the Outaouais region is of great concern to me. And climate, weather... Let me see. Yes, Environment Canada, via its Canadian Meteorological Services, already provides citizens with very interesting information, businesses as well, in provinces and territories, weather information that's accurate. There are warnings, official warnings sent out. But you think that a national strategy, such as that proposed in this bill, would also be of real use. Why wouldn't we just go over the current duties of the Canadian Meteorological Services? Wouldn't that be enough?
What we have is that not only does the federal government could create this strategy, but there is a need to ensure that we are still gaining the kind of long-term data that we need to inform these predictions. So one piece is around continuing to capture the historical data. This is one role that the federal government can play. So the hydrometric stations, many of which were active in this watershed up to 1990, but 44% of those have since been removed from service. And so we're finding that there is actually a decrease in how much we're measuring. So I can't speak to how that compares with the meteorological services, but we know for a fact that there is a decrease in this watershed of measuring on those flow levels. So that is one area where we would recommend to see that there be an improvement, and that could inform the strategy.
OK, on était rendu à bout de temps. Là,
Very well, we've come to the end of our time. We have 10 seconds. Perhaps I could very quickly add that another way that the Government of Canada could play a role would be by ensuring that all the regions in Canada have equal access to the information available, not only the provinces that have more stations. We must move on to Ms. Collins, but Mr. Longfield, you raised your hand.
Go after Ms. Collins.
OK, Ms. Collins, you have 6 minutes.
And thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. My first question is to Ms. Orlando and the Citizens Climate Lobby. Recently, the Citizens Climate Lobby published an article on the uninsurable world and really highlighting how the increasing severity of flooding, of droughts, of these kind of extreme weather events have some pretty detrimental impacts when it comes to insurance, including insurance company bankruptcies, elevated consumer prices, increasing publicly funded compensation, meaning the damages are being paid directly by taxpayers, and the withdrawal of insurance coverage. And so I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this and how we are at risk as regions become uninsurable.
Great question. So what Citizens Climate Lobby does is our volunteers gather information, expert information, and condense it into documents that we call laser talks. And it was shocking to read the data that our volunteers have put together. Here in Canada, there's over 1.5 million high-risk households that cannot obtain affordable flood insurance in Canada. There's also risks of like people losing their insurance because from year to year their insurance prices can go up. We are heading towards an uninsurable world, and we need to mitigate the climate crisis as fast as possible. So one of our recommendations is that you have all this modeling data, and we're just wondering, wouldn't it be helpful to have like a business as usual trajectory versus, mitigating as fast as possible? Like we need data to guide what is happening, because we are heading towards an uninsurable world, and the data is pretty dramatic in here. And there was a second laser talk for Ontario, and it was a climate risk report that was released quietly in the summer of 2023. And again, it talks about unless we mitigate this crisis, the agricultural impacts will be quite high. So not to get into numbers, I encourage you to read these reports. And I want to thank you for starting this flood and drought national program, because I once served as the co-chair of the Sudbury Adaptation Panel, and we need data to drive our decision making. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to this, and also to sound the warning. And thank you, Robert, for sounding the warning as well. Really appreciated listening to you, Mr. Sanford.
So my next question are for the Ottawa Riverkeepers, and really, you've talked a lot about the importance of data sharing. I'm curious, as you looked at the couple of suggestions that for this national strategy, how you see, in particular, well, you're focused on the Ottawa, but in particular, more rural, remote regions, how this kind of data will support them and their watershed management.
So while we work on the Ottawa River, we work throughout the entire watershed, and so many of the tributaries would flow through some of these remote areas. And I think again, it's that idea of having equal access to accurate flood or drought warning systems that is really critical. And also there is, of course, the impact of what's happening upstream or downstream. And so if there are changes that are happening that might affect rural populations, it's important that that's captured. And so we can't just concentrate on one area because more people live there. We really have to understand it at the watershed scale.
Thanks so much. And then also for Mr. Stanford, thanks again for your testimony and really highlighting the existential threat that we're facing. Hearing some of the testimony from the Citizens Climate Lobby about kind of the uninsurability of certain areas, and there was a article published today interviewing a woman in Kelowna. She bought her home and is now finding it impossible to insure because she's nearby wildfires. Many insurance companies have pulled out of California because of the severe drought conditions. I'm curious if in your work you're coming up against some of these insurance impacts of the climate crisis.
Yes, of course, because insurance issues are widespread. And the other thing, from a global perspective, there are many parts of the world that are being dramatically affected by extreme weather events for which insurance has never been available. Poor countries that have to rely on their own governments to be able to help people after emergency crisis that pummel them one time after another, places like Mozambique, places like parts of Pakistan. One of the things that I find interesting about this question, however, though, is it really is about growing uncertainty and how much uncertainty, how much does it cost? And I just came back from a series of conferences in the Okanagan where they're very, very afraid not just of the insurance issue, but whether or not their economy might not have to change as a result of how rapidly their climate is being altered. So what I find really interesting about this is that we're approaching urgency here.
Thank you.
The emergency that we're talking about is urgency.
Sorry,
Point of order.
Just a moment. Yes, Mr. Mazur.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to raise a point of privilege. On Thursday, March 21st, 2024, the Environment Committee passed a motion ordering Minister Guilbeault's department to produce information on how much the carbon tax will reduce emissions. The committee specifically ordered the production of the government's provincial territorial computable equilibrium model called EC Pro. This was a model that the government referenced to when asked how they projected their carbon tax would reduce emissions by 30%. The committee also ordered the production of all economic modeling associated with this model. Ordering the production of documents is a privilege of parliamentarians to effectively represent Canadians. I will draw to your attention to page 983 of Bosc and Gagnon's House of Commons Procedure and Practice, which states, and I quote, "The standing orders state that standing committees have the power to order the production of papers and records, another privilege that is rooted in the Constitution and which is delegated by the House. In carrying out their responsibility to conduct studies and inquiries, standing committees often have to rely on a wide array of papers to aid them in their work."
Mr. Mazur, can I interrupt for 1 second? I just want to tell the witnesses that we finished one round of questioning, and unfortunately we won't have, even before your intervention, we would not have had time for a second round. So, and I'm sorry about that. But I just wanted to thank all the witnesses for their answers, for being here, first of all, and for their answers to the questions. So thank you, and we please. It's an open public meeting. You can remain if you wish, but I'm sure you have